Some of you may recognize this image on the screen. It's from a 2018 interview that Jaden Smith did on Big Boy's radio show. There was a particular moment from the interview that ended up becoming a bit of a meme for a while. If you're familiar with the scene, Jaden is talking about just like his frustration with hanging out with people his age. And he's talking about how all they want to do is they just want to party and they want to talk about nonsense. And as he's expressing his frustration, he says the following. He says, dude, like, oh my God, like, can we talk about like the political and economic state of the world right now? Can we talk about the political and the economic state of the world right now? And it became an internet joke because basically people made fun of how serious and kind of catastrophic he sounded. And I saw the memes, I laughed at them. But the more that I think about it, I do think that Jaden was onto something a little bit in this moment because this interview took place about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago now. And if you pay attention to what gets talked about online today, particularly obviously in the digital space, there are a lot of things that do fall under the categories of let's talk about the political and economic state of the world. So according to Google Trends, internet searches today on topics like money or the economy or politics, they're obviously up from 5 years ago. You add to that the other rising trends, things like the mental health crisis, things like climate change, things like the homelessness crisis. And if you just kind of notice what conversations are getting louder and louder and which ones are getting more attention, it does start to seem like what Jaden wanted everyone to talk about back then is kind of what everyone is worried about right now. All of these really big global issues, and part of the reason, at least part of the reason, that these issues are talked about a lot today is because not only are these like big global issues, but they have their ways of actually finding their way into our own daily lives. So national conversations around things like gun violence means that some of you have had moments where you've been afraid to go to school because you were worried about your own safety. For some of the ladies in the room, you've resonated with certain social media things that you've seen around women's rights, and part of that came from you having this experience in the world where you're like, I don't always feel safe in public spaces. If it hasn't happened already, we're all likely gonna know someone who is negatively affected by things like cancer or other incurable diseases. And my point is, there are just a lot of things in the world that we could be worried about. There are a lot of things in the world that we could talk about. There are a lot of really big problems, from the problems that we can see the whole world is facing to the problems that we experience in our daily lives. This is one of the reasons why theologians will often refer to our world as broken or fallen. Because it doesn't take a genius to look around and go, hey, we got some issues. Like, I got issues, my family has issues, my community has issues, and so does the world. When we as humans then notice all these issues, I think it's a very natural question that we ask is, hey, where can we find God in all of this? Particularly for those of us who follow Jesus, like where can we find God in the midst of these issues? As we look around and we see the division in society, like how much people on one side of the culture wars hate people on the other side, as we see things like sickness and the suffering and the pain that so many people experience, and then all these issues on top of that, or that are either causing it or they're part of the problem. I think it is a very logical question to consider, hey God, where are you in the midst of all this? Or what are you doing? Where is God in the midst of our broken world that we call home? And I think the answer to that question can be found in the story of a Jewish woman who lived sometime around the 11th century BC, and her name was Naomi. I know the screen says Ruth. I'm going to make sense of that later. But Naomi's story starts with many of the problems that our world is still experiencing today. I'm going to show you the start of her story. This is Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel. Now, it's easy to miss it if you're unfamiliar with the biblical narrative, but when you start a story with that phrase, it's kind of like if I started a story by saying, hey, back in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, or even worse, if I were to go, hey, back when slavery was still being practiced in North America. Phrases like that, if I start a story like that, your mind immediately goes to a dark time, to a time when society was confused and chaotic, and you don't want to be a part of that culture. And that phrase that's on the screens is no different. If you were to read the book of Judges, it is, in my opinion, probably the saddest book in the entire Bible. Because you basically just read the story of a society that slips further and further into moral decay until eventually everyone is selfish, everyone is immoral, everyone is unjust. It's not a time that you would have wanted to live in. And that's why you read some of the most tragic tales in all the Bible in the book of Judges. And the story that we're going to study over the next 2 weeks, it takes place in the days when the judges ruled. So when we see Naomi's story start this way, it's kind of like the author is letting us know, hey, all of the problems that you can imagine, all the problems that you see in your world, all the problems that you're concerned with, and the ones that other people are concerned with, this story has all of them. All of the immorality, all of the injustice that you also experience in your world. And then it gets worse if you keep on reading. We'll actually go to the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth. It says, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Okay, that's our character. His wife is Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and when they reached Moab, they settled there. So you have this family that moves. We'll go to the next 2 verses. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. So Naomi's husband just died, all right? And now she's there with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. And this left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. This is the beginning of our main character's story, Naomi. It is marked by a famine that causes her family to leave their land. So they are separated from their community. I think it's safe to say they are experiencing some level of isolation or loneliness, kind of feeling like we don't belong here. We don't really have people who we can trust. And she goes on to experience the death of her husband and her 2 sons. Famine, loneliness, and death. That's how her story starts. It's marked by many of the same problems that we see and experience in our world today, which means it's also marked by some of the same questions. Like, God, where are you in all of that? And what are you doing? Now, spoiler alert, I think that Naomi's story helps us answer this question because Naomi's story starts with brokenness, but it ends with everybody calling her blessed. Naomi's story is recorded in what we call the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth has a fascinating literary design. This is my oversimplified version on the screen, okay? Ruth is broken up into 4 chapters. It's a very short book. You can read it in about 15 minutes. Chapter 1 opens with famine, loneliness, and death, and it's connected to the very end, which is chapter 4, where chapter 4 ends with food, community, and life. By life, I mean there's a birth of a new baby. Chapters 2 and 3 are structured very similarly, where each chapter starts with the main characters making a plan, and then they have a positive experience in their plan, and then they celebrate. Chapters 1 and 4 kind of, for the most part, highlight the experience of Naomi. Chapters 2 and 3 highlight the experience of the other 2 main characters in the story, Ruth and Boaz. And what's fascinating about Naomi's experience is that she goes from, in chapter 1, she is broken. And at the end, in chapter 4, she is blessed, but it has nothing to do with her. And it has everything to do with the other 2 main characters in the story, Ruth and Boaz. You see, after Naomi's husband and her 2 sons die, Naomi is left with just 2 daughters-in-law, right? The 2 women that her sons married. One of those women decides, hey, there's really nothing for me here anymore. I'm going to return back to my family of origin, and I'm going to go live with them. Naomi totally understands. She actually tries to get her other daughter-in-law to do the same thing, but the other daughter-in-law is named Ruth, and Ruth refuses. Ruth says, Naomi, I'm going to go back with you to your homeland, and we're going to figure this out together. And we'll pick up the story in the beginning of chapter 2. It says, now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz. Keep a note of that. That's our other main character. He was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, okay, so this is mother and daughter-in-law making a plan, let me go out into the harvest field to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. And Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather the grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Gosh, these names are not easy. Just notice right away, chapter 2 starts, and you can see it. You can see these 2 women making a plan Ruth tells Naomi, we need food. I'm going to go out and try to gather food. And while she's out, she meets Boaz. Ruth and Boaz meet. Chapter 2 goes on to tell the story of their interaction. Boaz sees Ruth. He is incredibly kind to her. He recognizes her faithfulness to her mother-in-law. He's like, hey, the whole town is kind of talking about what you've done in terms of you staying committed to your mother-in-law, even despite all of these tragedies. So Boaz supplies Ruth with a bunch of food, so much food, that when Ruth goes back home to her mother-in-law, Naomi, Naomi is like, you have so much food. How did you get this lucky? And this is later on from chapter 2. We'll go to verse 19. Where did you gather all this grain today? Naomi asked. Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked, and she said, the man I worked with today is named Boaz. And Naomi replied, may the Lord bless him. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband, which sounds weird, but remember Boaz is like knows who Elimelech is. So Naomi's like, he must have recognized this. That man, Boaz, is one of our closest relatives. He's one of our family redeemers. Family redeemers. In context, that term, which can be translated a variety of ways depending on which Bible translation you prefer, but it is referring to a civil law that God gave ancient Israel about how relatives have certain opportunities to help their family members. But that term also has other meanings. So that form of the word redeemer, it's often used throughout the Old Testament to refer to God or to refer to what God does for his people. So for example, right after God rescued the nation of Israel from Egypt, remember the story in Exodus where they're in slavery and then like God performs miracles through Moses, he rescues the people. The people sing a song to God as a kind of like, thank you so much for rescuing us. And here is what the lyrics say. In your unfailing love, they're talking to God, you will lead the people you have redeemed. It's that same word. In your strength, you'll guide them to your holy dwelling. So taking people out from the pressures of poverty and slavery, we could call that redemption. You have redeemed us. And this is something that God does. Later on in the story, when God is speaking to the prophet Isaiah, God actually identifies himself as a redeemer of the nation. He says, I, God, have swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. One commentary I read, it indicated that form of the word redeemed, it shows up about 100 times-ish, about 100 times throughout our Old Testament. And about 20 of those times shows up in the book of Ruth, which is really fascinating if you consider that Ruth is less than 1% of our Old Testament. Like it is nothing compared to the volume of literature that's there. And yet it contains one of the highest concentrations of the word redeemer. It's as if the author of the story wants us to catch on. That there is someone in this story who looks like and acts like God. There is someone who rescues people and redeems their past. And if you remember our narrative from a moment ago, Naomi says that person is Boaz. Here is a brief description of his actions throughout the narrative, because we can't read it all. So when Boaz shows up on the scene, he pronounces blessings on the people, already acting like God. Boaz goes on to protect the vulnerable, particularly Ruth, in that society. For a woman who is a widow to be out trying to harvest grain all by herself, it was incredibly dangerous. But Boaz protects her. Boaz is kind and generous. He shares abundantly of all the wealth that he has. And ultimately, at the end of the narrative, Boaz ends up redeeming and rescuing Ruth and Naomi from their tragedy, totally restores everything that he can restore. He doesn't have to do these things. He just chooses to graciously and sacrificially help these women who are very close to being helpless and hopeless. He changes their status, he provides for them, and he cares for them. And this is why some Christians throughout history have viewed Boaz as a sign that ought to lead our minds to the true Redeemer, which is Jesus. This is that in the same way Boaz actually cared for and provided for Ruth and Naomi, that in their story and essentially kind of saved them out of their situation, when we read that story, our minds would hopefully go to the one who has saved us, to the one who has loved us when we were unlovable, who has provided for us even when we didn't deserve it, by calling Boaz a redeemer over and over again. A term that is often applied to God. It's the author's way of letting us know that God is working to help these troubled women. That through Boaz, God is redeeming them in the way that God usually redeems his people, which is great news for these two women. But it still leaves us with our question, God, what are you doing for all of the other unnamed people in this story? It's great that Boaz is helping Naomi and Ruth, but how is God helping people like us who are still experiencing the effects of famine, loneliness, and death? Here's the end of the story. This is Ruth chapter 4, verses 13, 16, and 17. Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant. She gave birth to a son, dropping down a couple verses. It says the neighbor women. It's such a weird translation by the NLT. Think of like the women of the neighborhood. They said, now at last, Naomi has a son again. Technically, it's Ruth's son, but just because Naomi's like kind of the matriarch of the family, they're ascribing the benefit to her. And they named this son, Ruth and Boaz's son, they named him Obed. And Obed became the father of Jesse, who became the grandfather of David. Now, I know those verses don't sound like the healing of the world is about to happen, but this is actually where we start to get the answer to our question. If you remember, our story takes place during the time when the judges ruled. And I want to show you two contrasting statements real quick. The statement on top is a description of the time when the judges ruled. And you can read it. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. They had no king. And as a result of having no king, all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. And then the statement on the bottom, this is the ending of the book of Ruth. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. You may recognize the name David because, well, he's kind of a famous Bible character. David would grow up to become one of the best and most significant kings in the history of the nation of Israel. And it's from David's line that we end up getting Jesus generations later. So this mention of David at the end of Ruth's story, it's the author's way of telling you and I, as readers, that what God did for Ruth and Naomi, it wasn't just about them, but it was actually a picture of what God was going to do for the whole world through them. That while God was redeeming and restoring the stories of these women, he was also bringing about the king of a nation that would eventually bring peace and justice to those times of chaos and darkness. First, it was David, but eventually, it was Jesus. You see, by mentioning that King David came from this story, it's like the writer is telling you and I that what God did for Naomi, he is doing for the whole world, and he wants to do for every one of us, and that is redemption. He wants to actually bless us where we feel broken. He wants to heal us where we feel like we're hurting, and he wants to take every part of our life story, even the parts that we're not proud of or pleased with, and somehow use them to help other people. When I read the book of Ruth shows me a God who is at work and active behind the scenes, bringing redemption even to the most unlikely of places in our lives. And I trust that if God did that for Naomi and Ruth, he can do it for us. That the picture that is painted here is a God who is somehow always present, working on our behalf for good, which is why I believe that the invitation of God to all of us today is this. Don't just look for God, but look to God. Don't just look for God, but look to God. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with looking for God. That's why I add the word just there. It is appropriate to try to discern his activity in your life and try to figure out, like, hey, where are you? That is right and responsible Christianity. But if that is all we ever do, is God, where are you? If all we ever do is just look for him, we are going to constantly try to make sense, and when we constantly try to make sense of all the stuff that happens in our lives, we are going to live confused and frustrated lives. Where is he? I'll be honest, sometimes I don't know. I know he's there. I know he's always there. That's what history tells me, is that he's always there and he takes care of his children, that he provides for them, that he leads them, that he brings them into community and families. That's what he's passionate about, is connecting people to people and helping them heal and become whole and become the people that he created them to be. And sometimes that takes a while, but it's what he does because he's a redeemer. He's good, he's faithful, he's wise, and he wants what's best for us. And when we lose sight of that, well, we kind of lose sight of the best part of our faith, which is just Jesus himself. And to be clear, I'm really not trying to sidestep the question, where is God? We've done an entire series on that before. I just think that the book of Ruth calls us as Jesus followers to not just look for God, but to look to him, to consider his faithfulness, to think about all he's done for us or for our loved ones, to read the stories of Jesus and to develop a true and a loving relationship with our Redeemer. Essentially, to faithfully follow Jesus even when he's hard to find. And that's actually what we see in the other main character of our story, in Ruth, is we see someone who models a life who faithfully follows God even when he's hard to find. And she's who we'll talk about next week, but for today, I think the invitation of God to us is, hey, don't just look for him, but look to him. For those of us who have made a commitment, Jesus, you are the Lord of my life, may we never get caught developing a relationship with God that is just all about, God, what are you doing for me? Are you answering that prayer? Are you causing things to work out the way that I want you to? I really believe that he can and that in many cases he wants to. But the best part of following Jesus is gonna be Jesus. It's gonna be discovering how loving and faithful and compassionate he is for you and for the people in your world. It's gonna be discovering moments where you're like, dude, I didn't know you could forgive that. I didn't know you could redeem that. I didn't know you could take someone who looked like their life was going in a totally different direction and totally redeem them into something that looks like Jesus, that loves other people. That's what he's always done, and that's what he's still doing today. And I think the call for us is not just to look for him, but to look to him.